Hello, I'm Raj Chengappa from India Today and your host for Nothing But the Truth. Every week, we will deal with key issues of concern and bring you perspective and clarity as to why these matter to you and the one clear truth that emerges from this. It is rare for the Defense Minister, Mr. Rajnath Singh, and the three chiefs of the armed forces, the Army, the Air Force and the Navy, to hold a joint press conference as they did on June 14th. People like us from the media know that they only come together for a very significant announcement. And what they said on June 14th was certainly quite momentous and significant because they announced a new transformative and radical scheme for recruitment called Agneepath. Under the Agneepath scheme, they said that there would be both short-term employment and long-term employment, and the idea behind it was to induct or inject young blood into the armed forces and at the same time provide training and skills for those who do the short term so that they could be employed elsewhere and bring a military ethos to their activities when they rejoin society. These are laudable aims, and I would describe the Agnipath scheme as bold and brave and an idea whose time has come. But, and there is a but, the devil lies in the details and particularly in the execution. So in this episode of Nothing But the Truth, we will analyze whether the Agnipath scheme is the best way to go and why was there so much angst and anger among a certain sections of the public and ex-servicemen as well. Was that justified as well? So now let's look at the Agnipath scheme itself and why it is such a radical, transformative scheme as it was being called. Let's be clear that this recruitment is only for sailors, airmen and soldiers for these forces and not for the officers. The officer system of recruitment will stay the same. This year, they will recruit 46,000 of them, and out of that, 40,000 will be selected for the Army, 3,000 for the Navy, and 3,000 for the Air Force. Now, the age group is between 17 and a half years and 21 years to be eligible. But this year, as a special concession, because in the last 2 years there was no recruitment on, the age group has been extended up to 23 years, only for this year. Now, at the end of 4 years, 75% of the recruits will be asked to be exited, and only 25% will be retained for regular employment. That could go up to 15 years or more. Now, this is completely unlike the earlier system, where all those selected would be recruited for a minimum of 15 years, unless in between they had either for medical reasons or for indiscipline, their services had to be terminated. What the Agniveers, as they're called, the ones that are exiting at the end of 4 years, the 75% of them would get is, apart from the training and the skills that they imbibed, in their bank accounts, something close to rupees 11 lakhs, which is exempt from income tax, but they will not be entitled to other perks and things that normally ex-servicemen enjoyed, whether it was canteen facilities or other benefits that would accrue to them. The Army's and the Armed Forces argument was that they would be trained sufficiently during that 4 years, and that would make them eligible to get employment elsewhere. So why did the Armed Forces decide on the Agnipath scheme as the way forward? One of the major reasons, they said, was that the average age of Indian Armed Forces personnel was now 32 years. That was very high for the Armed Forces, because if you looked at USA and you looked at Britain, the average age between in these major powers was anything between 26 to 28 years. So the idea was that by inducting these young recruits, you could bring down the age to 26 years, an average of 26 years. And that was important because they felt that at that age, you were inducting a whole lot of new blood that would get in, and this would make a difference in terms of the fighting capability. Of course, you would need the experience and you would need all the other things that is taken for granted. But this would inject a whole new dynamism to the army, and particularly our armed forces, and particularly given the fact that today's wars use and employ an enormous amount of technology that you and I know about. We see it on the video games that is there, but this is in real life. There are drones, there are cyber warfare. It has changed the nature of battle. And they believe that the youngsters are more savvy in handling these kind of conditions, and therefore it is very important that you have the right mix. The other reason that is given is that the ratio, particularly in the army, between what is called as sepoys or jawans and their non-commissioned officers, their seniors, is now 1:1.28, which means that there are more seniors than there are recruits. When I spoke to Lieutenant General Anil Puri, who's the Additional Secretary of the Department of Military Affairs, he made a very interesting phrase. He coined it. He called it the Josh to Hosh ratio. Now he says the Josh to Hosh ratio should be 1:1. And when you have that, it makes it an ideal fighting force, a formidable fighting force. And the endeavor of this particular scheme is that by 2030, you would reach that optimum ratio that will make the army fighting fit and become a formidable force for its opponents. While the Agnipath was hailed as a step in the right direction, particularly for lowering the average age of armed personnel in our armed forces, officials did not talk about the real reason that they were doing it. Yes, lowering the age is one of the prime reasons that the armed forces is doing it, but there is another major reason, which is to reduce the levels of salary and pensions being paid out in the armed forces and bring it to sustainable levels. Now let me try and explain simply how this works. The overall armed forces budget is rupees 5.25 lakh crore this year, 22-23. And out of that, close to 53% goes towards salaries and pensions. And only 27% goes towards what is called capital expenditure, which is needed to buy new aircraft, tanks, bring modern equipment, whether it's telecom and everything else. Now the right ratio that people say is, the experts say, that you must have your capital expenditure up to something like between 40 to 50%, and your salaries and pensions must go down. Clearly, the armed forces, particularly the army, if you analyze it, which actually enjoys a lion's share of the budget, something like 58% of the total budget is theirs. They have an average rupees 3 lakh crores. Their spending, in fact, is even more skewed. In their case, in the army's case, almost 76% of their budget goes towards salaries and pensions, and only 8% is put towards modernization of the armed forces. Clearly, that has to change, because if you want a very modern, well-equipped army, which is at cutting edge, you have to bring in the whole lot of equipment, modern equipment, the latest ones, and spend on that, apart from training your manpower and keeping them fighting fit. And now, if you look at even the pensions, and if you all heard of the one rank, one pension scheme that was implemented by the Modi government in July 2014, that also began to jack up expenses in the last 5 years. It was not the main reason, but if you look at pensions per se, they account now for almost 26% of the budget. That's rupees 1.19 lakh crores. And if you take a look at our health expenditure, which is in a critical period, it is far less than that. The health expenditure that we are doing is far less than the pensions that we are paying out for the armed forces. Now, I'm not saying that these are comparable. I'm only just giving it to you to understand the differences that are there. The armed forces does require, they've served the nation well. There is no argument against giving them the pensions that they deserve or the salaries that they deserve. They are our brave hearts. They need it. They put their lives on the line for us. And this is not to in any way discredit their contribution. I'm only giving statistics to say that this is the kind of imbalances that have happened over a period of time, and they need to change. In terms of pensions saved, because the retirement is much earlier than before, One organization, a think tank in Bangalore called Takshashila, estimated that you could save as much as rupees 34,500 crores over a period of time because of the Agnipath scheme. And as I mentioned earlier, it is rupees 1.19 lakh crores of pension that we pay, so you're looking at saving a third of that. But apart from saving salaries, how does the Agnipath scheme help in another major endeavor, which is you need to right-size the armed forces, particularly the army. Now, the army's strength today is close to 1.18 million people or personnel. Recently, 2 years ago, it had a distinction of becoming the world's largest ground force that is there. And that distinction came for a somewhat dubious reason, because China decided that in 2020 it would cut the size of its army, the People's Liberation Army, by 50%, which meant that from 2 million that it had, it would bring it down to 1 million. That is what made India the largest ground force. But this is something that we need to tackle, because clearly at that levels, it is considered too high. To give you another example, USA, which is, everyone knows, is a superpower, its working armed forces, working army particularly, is 4,85,000. That is almost half the size that the Indian army is. And recently it cut back that by another 13,000, so that it said it wanted to improve the quality. And by the way, China, which I mentioned, the 50% cut was not because they said they had budgetary constraints. They said they were doing it so that they could spend more money on the Navy and the Air Force, which has taken prominence given the kind of tensions that have been around, apart from making it technologically sound and at the cutting edge. So China was investing in equipment as well as in the two armed forces, which were using a lot of the modern warfare. The cutting edge warfare is now being used by the Air Force particularly. When you look at drones and other kinds of things, of course the army does have some of these themselves, but it is control of the air and the kind of technological revolution that has happened that needs the shift towards spending more on these forces. So what India is doing when it does the Agnipath scheme is that last year, when the defense minister talked about vacancies, there was something close to 97,000 vacancies in the Indian army, because for the 2 years of COVID, they could not recruit. Before that, in 2018 and 2019, the average recruitment, if you take, was anything between 60,000 to 90,000. So I would take an average of 80,000 or 70,000. Now, under the Agnipath scheme, normally the army earlier was recruiting an average of 60 to 70 or 80,000. Under the Agnipath scheme, it is already coming down, because as I had mentioned, only 40,000 people are being selected this year. Next year it might go, for the army particularly, 46 is the total. Navy gets 3,000, Air Force gets 3,000, so 46. But out of that, so as I said, 40,000 is what the army is recruiting. So already they are reducing, apart from the 9 vacancies that they have, they are reducing the numbers that are getting into the army. And because after 4 years, only 25% would be eligible, and if you take that, and I'm taking, that's 10,000 people at the end of 4 years that will stay on in the army. So after 4 years, you will find that steadily there would be a reduction. Now, when we spoke to top defense experts, they said that the endeavor is to bring down the Indian army over a period of time from the current figure of 1.18 or 1.2 million strong army to about 1 million, 10 lakhs. That would make it more sustainable, but they will not mention this openly because, as you know, India faces an unemployment problem, and the Modi government would not want to be seen at this time to be cutting back significantly on the armed forces. So while this is a long-term endeavor, and whoever I spoke to denied that the Agnipath scheme was ever to reduce forces or the salary bill, they said that there is enough money, and every time the government says they want that if the armed forces need more money, they're willing to put it. The real, as I mentioned, the real reasons are that there is definitely an effort to bring down these in a manner that is sustainable. And this period will take about 10 years, and therefore they think it would go. So all these things, given the kind of positive factors that have been talked about, lowering the age, reducing the salary components, increasing the capital expenditure, and overall right-sizing the army. Why is that? While it seems all positive, there is so much angst and so much of protest from certain sections of society and sizable sections of the armed forces. What is the reasons that they feel unhappy about? Well, let's just say that the Modi government has a penchant for making dramatic announcements almost overnight, and in many cases not taking all the key stakeholders into account. Now, the armed forces denies this and says, no, the Agnipath was a very carefully planned scheme. It was on the anvil for 2 years. And when I spoke to General Puri, he said, whom I mentioned earlier, the Additional Secretary of the Department of Military Affairs, he said that close to 750 hours of meetings were held in the last 2 years that included within the armed forces. It included interactions with the Ministry of Defense as well as with the whole of government, which includes the Prime Minister's office as well. Now, if you calculate 750 hours, that's close to 31 days, 24/7 if you worked, without sleep, that's what it amounts to. Yes, they have sort of certainly done the exercise, but from what I learned is that while the exercise began 2 years ago, it lay dormant for a while, and then really picked up speed only in May when there was a rush to have it out. Now, the earlier schemes that was being proposed, from what I understand, was called Tour of Duty. It was not called Agnipath. That christening, the name was given only recently. Now, this Tour of Duty is very similar to what the other armed forces in the world do. USA, UK, you name any major force, Russia, China, all of them have these short-term courses for training them, their personnel. Some are called conscripts, which is not voluntary. That means you have to serve. In Israel, there's a conscript. Some are voluntary, that you can volunteer to do it. You will get this training. Some could be for anything between 1 year to 6 years to 10 years. But there is this short-term employment that other countries have done. So it is not unusual for what India is doing on this matter. But what they had done earlier was, in that before they announced Agnipath, was that they would want to keep 50% of them, not 25% as they have now done, and 50% would exit. But it seems that the decision to go with 25% and keep 75% as the Agniveers who would exit was taken apparently directly by the Prime Minister's office, and particularly Prime Minister Narendra Modi, because he was very keen that this particular program would develop the skills for youngsters between 17 and 21, equip them with extraordinary skills. That is what the training in the armed forces gives you, apart from physical, the kind of things and the challenges that you face. By the age of 21, you would have a whole band every year of trained, skilled people with the military ethos of discipline joining the society, and that would change India in a way, in a positive way. And also these people normally would have been unemployed for this period, and that the Prime Minister didn't say, but I'm also just giving you the analysis of that, is that they would then also get some money at the end of that year, a corpus of 11 lakhs or so, which is quite substantial, and will be able to find opportunities elsewhere, employment opportunities, rather than sitting idle at home for those 4 years. They are trained and they can go out at the age of 24, 25, and a lot of government departments as well as the private sector would want to employ them. This was the basis of why they moved towards the 25%, 75% figure. As I mentioned earlier, 25% would help right size the army, and 75% you were getting a trained manpower that could be useful for society. That was the philosophy behind it. But then why did you see so much of strife, so many applicants coming, many of them burning trains, many of them destroying public property? What was their angst? Now, for the first reason is that while the armed forces may claim that they had discussed this for the past 2 years, for a majority of the applicants that were aspiring to join them, the armed forces, the announcement of the Agnipath scheme came like a bombshell. Now, these applicants are not casual in their approach to it, because they actually invest 2 to 3 years getting themselves physically fit as well as investing in coaching institutes, which could cost them anything between 1 lakh to 3 lakhs before they appear for this. Now, in their first announcement, they said that the age limit would be only 21. The army and the armed forces should have anticipated, because particularly the army had stopped recruitment for 2 years, there would be a lot of people that would be very, very unhappy with the decision because they had, done all the investments and now they were not eligible for it because they had moved the age to 21. So immediately the MOD and the Ministry of Defense and the Armed Forces announced, but it was an afterthought, it looked like an afterthought, that they would increase the age to 23. The other reason is that a lot of the people look upon the armed forces as a secure, long-term employment. They do not treat it casually like this is a training program, I will get it and I'll come out. When they invested, and a lot of people that we spoke to, India Today magazine spoke to, said very clearly that the investment they're making for is that they would like a regular employment, at least 15 years in the army, and a lot of people expressed that they were not contemplating coming out in 4 years' time and again looking for a job. They thought that they were preparing themselves to a career, a future in the army. And this is an argument that a lot of the ex-servicemen also said, that you shouldn't treat the army as a use and discard process of hiring. That the commitment of the recruits, if they had regular employment with them and assured regular employment, would be far greater. So even if you have these short-term people serving, their commitment will not be as much because they're not sure of getting in, so they might be casual about their approach and want to just use it and exit from the army or armed forces that's there. So this is an issue that they had to address. Now, instead of becoming a radical reform, the Ministry of Defense was on the back foot and was getting defensive. And so, to, in many ways, assure these people and assuage their concerns, they announced a series of reservations for the ones that are exiting, the ex-Agniveers as they would be called, as they move out to this, the 75%. They said, okay, 10% will be reserved of the jobs available in the Central Armed Police Forces, the CAPF. They also said that public sector units and the Coast Guards, the Defense Public Sector units and the Coast Guards, they would also reserve 10%. Apart from that, the Ministry of Civil Aviation came out and said, look, they are well trained and we will certainly open up and find jobs for them, as did many state governments. And the private sector too got involved. The Tatas and the Mahindras said that they would be happy to recruit these people in their things once they came out. Now, of course, the track record, unfortunately, of that kind of recruitment of ex-servicemen in the past has not been very encouraging. For instance, the armed forces, the police forces do have a reservation, the central police forces do have a reservation of 10% for ex-servicemen, but so far, when media has checked this, it has been found to be just 1 to 2% rather than the 10% reserved for them. Some sectors have done well, but no sector has really fulfilled that particular quota that was there. So their concerns are genuine, and this is something that the Modi government has to look out at the end of 4 years. The crisis will come only at that point. Apart from the heartburn of applicants, many army veterans, armed forces veterans have been unhappy with the content of the Agnipath scheme and the way it has been rolled or evolved. One of the issues they say is that why are you focusing on downsizing the armed forces? And on the other hand, the Modi government has announced that 1 million jobs would be filled in the next 2 years by filling up the vacancies that were there in the various central government departments. So as one expert told me, it's okay to have a bloated Babudin, but for people like us who put our lives on the line for the country, you are cutting us back. And the most critical component, whether you have technology, whether you have research, whatever you do, it is the man or the woman behind that is the final cutting edge that gives you. And you need to invest on that. Now, this is a very valid argument. The other point that they talked about was, if you wanted only hire, say, 40,000 instead of 60,000 or 80,000, why didn't you come out and say it openly? Why are you trying to make us into skill development organization? The army has more, and the armed forces have more important tasks than just to train people. And if you wanted quality, yes, you could have hired, instead of saying 46,000 and taking only 10,000, you could have hired 12,000, 13,000 and knocked off 2,000 or 3,000. Why do you want to train this? Why are you treating the armed forces as a skill development unit? You should have come out openly and said, this is what our concerns is, and as it happened elsewhere in the world, people will understand. And even the armed forces is a very disciplined force. They will, whatever the government wants them to do, they might grumble at behind that, but they will go ahead and execute it to the best of their abilities. The other issues that they raised are a little more complex and would be better understood by the armed forces personnel themselves. I'm just listing them for you. One, of course, was the fact that this 4 years would actually make what they call it a mercenary force, in the sense that the camaraderie that existed between, which is very important. After all, you're going to give your life, you're going to fight an enemy, and you need that bonding that happens. That would be broken. That would not be continuous as if they're exiting at that particular point of time. And the spirit with which they're joining, in the sense serving the nation, putting their life on the line, might be diluted. The other concern, they said, was that the army had a tradition that is almost 300 to 400 years of hiring various regiments based on caste or regional or religious denominations. And these have worked very effectively in the past. This new no-class, all-India kind of, or all-class, all-India recruitment that they talk about with Agneepath had, would disturb this particular arrangement. Now, the army has clarified, the armed forces has clarified that they will not touch this regimental system, it will go on as is, and that the recruitment is so slow that it will take 10 years for them to achieve most of their objectives. So there is a huge sort of time gap where the armies or the armed forces basic things will not be diluted at all. They've also said that combat troops and all the fighting forces will not be cut back. They say that today technology is available in terms of, and manpower is available to take care of a lot of the support activities that the army was doing. And as an example, if there is a vehicle maintenance to be done, if there is certain kinds of support staff that is required, particularly in peace areas, where if you need to repair something, earlier the army would have all the mechanics and everybody being hired. Today, if you're in a station like in Bangalore or wherever it is, there is enough private people that you could send your vehicle to for repair rather than the army doing it directly. It's really in the forward areas where you need the emergency sort of attention that is there, and therefore you could rationalize a lot of these things. Also, there was a complaint that the training period was too less, it is being compressed, and the people will not there. Again, they say that look, you can't use standards that were there 10 to 15 years ago because technology has come in a big way. It is like saying that in the past there was post that was going, and therefore you must stay with post despite the fact that you have email. Clearly, email has speeded up all our communications, and that is what has happened across the board, and therefore training can be given anything between, currently what is being planned is anything between 6 months to 8 months. And they say that by the time that period is there, that person is fighting fit enough to get into the army or the Air Force or the Navy and do their kind of jobs, they will be screened for that. So they are very, very clear that this is there. And what they did also was that when these applicants went out of hand and they started burning public property, which is unacceptable, they came out with a very firm, and rightly, a very firm ruling that anyone indulging in arson or in riots or has police complaints on this will be disqualified. They cannot do this. And that is absolutely right. For the armed forces, anyone joining, it is a disciplined force, it believes in the service of the nation, and this is not something that they should be doing. So that was a clear message to them. Apart from that, the armed forces veterans themselves have now come out and said that once the scheme, particularly some of them who had opposed it earlier, said once the scheme is implemented, we need to move forward. The government is the boss in this matter, and we should extend all support to it, and the opportunity for tweaking or making corrections, and the government has also said so, that the 4 years experience they have would help them in fine-tuning it so that whatever concerns that had been raised should be solved in that matter. Prime Minister Modi has also came out indirectly, while this was a very good move that the armed forces said in terms of firmness of that there will be no rollback in this. The Prime Minister also reiterated that, of course indirectly, and said, look, Initially, all reforms will be a bit painful and unpleasant. But these, in the long run, will change the way we do things, and they will create milestones in reforms. As I said earlier, I believe that this is a bold and brave idea whose time has come. But the proof will be in the execution and in the years ahead. And to me, that would be the next Agni Pariksha for the Modi government. Thank you for listening to this episode of Nothing But the Truth. I look forward to having you with me next week.